If the reports that the European Commission is considering enforcement actions against X are accurate, it represents an unprecedented act of political censorship and an attack on free speech. With that single sentence, the social media platform X, formerly Twitter, has thrown down the gauntlet against the European Union. The platform's Global Government Affairs Division issued a fiery response to reports that Brussels is preparing enforcement actions under the Digital Services Act, DSA. X says it has already gone above and beyond to comply with the new regulations, and now it's preparing to fight back with every legal, political, and public tool available. This isn't just about moderation policies. It's about the collision between centralized EU bureaucracy and digital free speech on a global scale. The flashpoint: what the EU is threatening. Under the DSA, platforms with more than 45 million EU users are subject to very large online platform, VLOP obligations. That means transparency on algorithmic ranking, strict rules on content takedown response times, extensive moderation of hate speech, disinformation, and illegal content. Fines up to 6% of global annual turnover for violations. The European Commission reportedly believes X is not doing enough to moderate so-called harmful content. Specific complaints center around delayed removal of flagged posts, alleged algorithmic amplification of extremist views, insufficient reporting to EU authorities. Brussels now appears poised to launch a formal enforcement action, which could trigger hefty fines or even access restrictions. X's response: not on our watch. X's defense: we went above and beyond. In their statement, X Global Government Affairs insists the company has made major strides. Real-time transparency dashboards for policy enforcement, new labeling systems for state-affiliated media and manipulated content, a dedicated team monitoring for election interference and violent threats, AI-driven flagging systems trained on EU-specific legal definitions. They argue the EU's real complaint isn't non-compliance, it's non-conformity. In other words, Brussels doesn't like what people are saying on the platform, and it wants editorial control under the guise of safety. EUX is drawing a hard line. We'll comply with the law, but we won't rewrite our platform to satisfy ideological agendas. A global free speech battlefront. This fight is bigger than X, bigger than the EU. It's the front line of a global war over digital sovereignty and speech. The EU sees itself as a regulatory superpower, exporting its laws via platforms and compliance mandates. The US has no equivalent DSA, and the First Amendment still casts a long legal shadow. Countries like India, Brazil, and Turkey have their own laws and their own demands. For X, the challenge is maintaining one global standard while facing 27 different European speech regimes. They're not just defending their business model. They're defending the idea that speech isn't a bureaucratic checkbox. It's a civilizational value. Political censorship or public safety. The European Commission insists its actions are about protecting users, not censoring ideas. They cite the spread of Russian propaganda during the Ukraine war, far-right incitement surrounding EU elections, medical misinformation during the COVID pandemic. But critics say the definitions of these categories are intentionally vague, leaving platforms vulnerable to arbitrary enforcement and political bias. X isn't denying the need for some moderation. What it rejects is the idea that speech must be filtered through an EU ideological lens. Political censorship, disguised as safety regulation, is still censorship. The stakes for Elon Musk. This battle lands directly in the lap of X's owner, Elon Musk. Musk has championed X as a digital town square, a place where ideas, even uncomfortable ones, are debated rather than deleted. He's already scrapped legacy censorship policies, restored banned accounts, and vowed to protect lawful but awful speech. Now, Brussels is testing that philosophy. Does Musk stand firm and risk fines and deplatforming in Europe, compromise and risk alienating his user base and values? This may be the single most consequential legal fight of his career. Because if Brussels wins, it will show that supranational institutions can dictate speech norms globally, even for platforms based in free speech jurisdictions. The DSA, what makes it so powerful? The Digital Services Act isn't just another regulation. It's a paradigm shift in how the internet is governed. Key provisions include extraterritorial application. Platforms outside the EU must comply if they serve EU users. Rapid takedown mandates. Content must be removed within hours of government notice. Audits and algorithmic disclosure. Platforms must explain how content is prioritized. Gatekeeper rules. VLOPs face added responsibilities to prevent systemic risks. The DSA doesn't regulate speech directly, but it regulates the platforms that host it. And that's the point. Because once you control the infrastructure, you control the conversation. Civil liberties groups. Divided and cautious, free speech advocates are split. Groups like Article 19 and Access Now welcome the DSA's focus on platform accountability. Others, like the Electronic Frontier Foundation, EFF, warn it opens the door to state-driven moderation via proxy. Some worry about the precedent. If the EU can mandate content takedowns, what's stopping other regimes from doing the same? China, Iran, Russia. This becomes a template for global speech control, no matter how well-intentioned its origins. Legal options. How X could fight back. If the EU initiates enforcement, X has several legal avenues. Challenge DSA interpretation in the European Court of Justice. Claim extraterritorial overreach of EU law. Petition for injunctive relief to block implementation during appeal. Seek diplomatic support from the U.S. government and allies. Leverage international law on human rights and freedom of expression. This won't be fast, but it will be loud and public. Expect a PR campaign, legal filings, and maybe even geofencing certain content to avoid fines. But make no mistake, X is preparing for a long war of attrition. The political subtext. Europe's fragility. Why now? The EU faces rising populist movements across multiple member states. Brussels bureaucrats fear misinformation swaying elections. Legacy media outlets are losing ground to decentralized platforms like X. This isn't just about safety. It's about power. The EU wants to be the internet's regulator-in-chief, and X is the last major platform not yet brought to heel. This isn't about one company. It's about who governs speech in the digital age. Final thought, free speech or fee speech? The battle over X and the EU is no longer theoretical. It's here. And the question is simple. Should unelected EU regulators decide what the world is allowed to say online? X says no. And in doing so, it has drawn a line in the sand for every platform, publisher, and person who values free thought. This isn't just a tech story. It's a civilizational crossroads. Because if freedom dies in Brussels, it won't stop there. It will spread. And what begins as moderation will end in managed reality. So stay alert, stay loud, stay free. Should X comply with the EU's demands or fight for digital free speech worldwide? Let us know below. Like, subscribe, share this before it's disinformation, because truth doesn't need permission.